Before there was silver, there was smoke. The ships came in before dawn, when the light was still gray and useless to whoever was standing on the shore. This was not a raid in any sense that produces glory. It was a procurement operation, and the men climbing out of the longships were not interested in combat, because combat was a cost, a risk to the assets they'd come to collect, a complication that slowed the schedule and produced injuries that reduced how much cargo the ship could carry home. The thatch burned first, not for spectacle. Fire creates confusion, drives people into open ground, and removes the option of barricading a door. Livestock scattered. Grain stores went up fast, because grain stores were not what this trip was for. The people who came out of the burning buildings, not the very old, not the very young, the ones who would survive a week at sea, were taken by the arms and bound. The ships waited at the waterline with their prows turned back toward open water, and nobody on that beach was thinking about Valhalla. Tonight we follow the money. It begins in the fire, and it does not stop moving until it reaches a scale. There is a version of this story that every heritage site and streaming series tells with real conviction, and it is not, strictly speaking, a lie. The Norse of the 9th and 10th centuries covered a genuinely staggering amount of territory, trade and settlement stretching from the coast of Newfoundland to the markets of the Caspian Sea, carried there by a relatively small population in open boats across some of the most dangerous water on the planet. That takes navigational skill that modern sailors still study. It takes courage that does not need embellishing. The popular image gives you the warrior explorer, fearless, driven by the promise of glory and a seat in Valhalla. Expanding the known world one voyage at a time, the same spirit museums invoke when they use the word exploration instead of the word this episode is going to use instead. The trade network really did exist, and it really was remarkable. Hedabee's markets. The Dublin waterfront. The river routes the Rus operated down through what is now Russia and Ukraine. This was commerce on a scale that connected the Norse world to Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, moving goods and silver across a distance that most of medieval Europe never touched. The ships that made that possible were, by any technical measure, extraordinary. The men who sailed them were, by any physical measure, tough in ways modern life rarely tests anyone. The documentaries linger here, the launch, the open horizon, the specific romance of a small wooden hull against an ocean that has killed better-equipped sailors 1,000 years later. It is an easy story to fall in love with, and falling in love with it is not, on its own, a mistake. None of that is manufactured. What's missing from the version on the poster is the answer to a simple question. What exactly was the commodity that financed all of it in the first place? Begin with what bound means in physical terms. Wrists tied behind the back with whatever rope was on the ship. Not rope designed for the purpose, so it bit at the exact points where the tendons flex, and the pulse sits close to the skin. The walk to the ship was short or long, depending on how far inland the settlement sat, and for the length of that walk. The bound person occupied a strange legal gap, still, technically, a member of their own community, until the ship cleared the shoreline. After that, they were cargo. The transition needed no ceremony and no paperwork. It needed only distance. The crossing that followed, days, sometimes a week, in weather the North Atlantic does not negotiate on, was an education in a specific kind of helplessness that the sagas never once describe from the cargo's point of view. There is a wound in this story that this episode does not have room to examine properly. What a body does in the hours after the binding, and what happens to a body that survives the crossing and then lives another 20 years inside a household that was never its own. That record exists in full. The wound pathology, the specific mortality pattern among the women who made that crossing, the pelvic trauma the skeletons carry. It is catalogued case by case in the book this series is adapted from. Here, the ledger only has time to log that the account is open. Then it has to move because the silver is still moving too. In 922 AD, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled with an embassy to the Volga Bulgars and kept a careful written record of what he saw among the Rus, the Norse traders and raiders working the river networks east of the Baltic. He was not naive, and he was not writing from a position of moral shock. Slavery was not foreign to the world he came from. He wrote as a thorough professional documenting a routine transaction. Enslaved women brought down the river, inspected, purchased and used by their buyers without interval or privacy as an ordinary part of the sale itself. Nothing in his account suggests this required explanation to the people conducting it. The silver those transactions generated moved west and financed the next season of raiding and the next round of shipbuilding. Islamic dirhams show up in Scandinavian hoards in quantities that reflect a sustained commercial relationship, not occasional trade. And the genetic record has since confirmed what the economics always implied. DNA from Iceland's Viking Age founding population shows the male line was overwhelmingly Scandinavian, while roughly half the female line traces to the British Isles and Ireland, a pattern inconsistent with voluntary migration and entirely consistent with the mechanism Ibn Fadlan described in writing, 300 years before anyone thought to ask the bones to confirm it. Warrior graves across the Norse world hold something small enough to miss and precise enough to matter. Folding scales, hinged at the center, built to collapse flat and travel in a pouch. They weighed silver, and the silver they weighed was not sorted by sentiment. A fragment of a Northumbrian altar cross weighed exactly what an arm ring weighed, which weighed exactly what a coin from Baghdad weighed. The scale did not record where the metal came from. It recorded mass. The hoards this produced, hack silver, chopped and tested and weighed down to fragments, read less like trophy collections and more like a diversified portfolio, liquid and provenance-blind, exactly the asset structure a professional would hold if the goal was value rather than memory. That is the instrument of an accountant, not a berserker, and it was carried into the grave by men who thought about liquidity carefully enough to want the tool with them in whatever came next. The system got more efficient over time, not less. The Dangeld payments extracted from English kingdoms between 991 and 1012 AD ran past 150,000 pounds of silver. A transfer of wealth so large it shows up in the archaeological record as an institutional pattern, not a string of individual thefts. It worked the way a protection racket works. Establish the threat. Collect the payment. Return to refresh both. The Norse leader Thorkel the Tall collected Danegeld after a campaign that ended with the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, then entered the paid service of the English king he had just been extorting. The threat converted cleanly into an employment contract. Same silver, no fighting, no damage to the ships, no plunder to carry home at all, which was, from a purely operational standpoint, the entire point. And at the far end of the same ledger sits the ship burial. The point where a captured person's labor could end not in old age, but on a pyre. Ibn Fadlan documented one directly. A Rus chieftain's funeral on the Volga, and a slave girl selected, by her own household's account, willingly, to die alongside him and be burned in the same fire. Whatever willingly meant inside a system that had owned her since the day she was captured, she did not choose to be property in the first place. And property does not get to decline the final entry made against its owner's estate. Hold the whole chain in view at once. The fire that took a person off one ledger, the market that put a price on them, the scale that weighed what they were traded for, the tribute payment that scaled the whole operation into something closer to taxation, and the funeral pyre that could close the account entirely. None of it required hatred. Ibn Fadlan does not describe men enjoying cruelty. He describes men doing business, carefully, the way you would expect people to behave who had found a transaction that worked and had no reason within their own moral framework to stop running it. This is what the word expansion launders when a museum plaque uses it instead of naming the mechanism directly. Raiding, in the version this episode is building, was not an expression of a violent temperament that happened to also produce trade networks. It was a business model. Better margins than farming. A faster return than trade. A lower barrier to entry than either. And it was pursued with exactly the unsentimental calculation that shows up whenever any group of people identifies a high-return, low-risk target and exploits an information advantage over it. We recognize that pattern instantly in almost any other historical context. We recognize it in this one only when the longship's aesthetic stops doing the work of hiding the arithmetic underneath it. The uncomfortable finding is not that the Norse were capable of violence. Every expanding power in every century has been capable of violence. The uncomfortable finding is that the violence here was rational, planned, iterated, refined across 2 centuries into an increasingly efficient system. And rational violence does not evaporate the way an outburst does. It compounds. It returns next season. It gets better at what it does. A raid that works gets repeated. A tribute that gets paid gets demanded again. The scale in the warrior's grave did not care whether the silver it weighed had come from a church roof or a slave auction. And that indifference is the most honest artifact in this entire episode, because it is the one piece of evidence that was never built to flatter anyone. This is the entry the exploration narrative leaves out, and it is not a footnote to the larger story. It is underneath the larger story, funding it, the way a foundation sits underneath a house that gets all the photographs. Call the system a business model instead of a raiding culture, and it does not become smaller. It becomes legible. And once it is legible, the courage and the navigation and the trade network do not get to sit in a separate, unexamined room from the fire that paid for all of it. The pit at Coppergate showed you what the Norse body carried inside it. The folding scale shows you what the Norse economy was actually built to carry. Neither one asked to be found. Both were simply left behind, unedited, waiting for someone willing to weigh them honestly. The scale does not distinguish between the raid, the tribute, and the pyre. They are the same entry, at different stages of the same system, and rational violence is not diminished by its rationality. It is amplified. It scales.